I often look at the breakdown of polling, and my biggest beef is they're too educated. Well,
Hmm.
what do I mean by that?
Welcome back to Real Clear Politics on Sirius XM. I'm Andrew Walworth, and our next guest is Salena Zito. She is a reporter for the Washington Examiner and a somewhat frequent guest on this program. So, Salena, welcome back.
Hey, thanks so much for having me.
So you have this piece in the Examiner, ran on the front page of RCP. People can find it there. The headline is, "What is behind the simmering information war on polling?" It's a topic of some interest at RCP, I will say. And you're complimentary to our work, and I appreciate that. But flattery aside, what are you worried about when it comes to polling?
So, there was this. I've just sort of watched polling being drawn into the warfare that happens in American politics. And, I started wondering, well, what was behind it? In particular, because it really targeted RCP. There was a New York Times story in 2020 that I really struggled to find accurate and fair. And then there was another story in, let's see, it was October of last year, right before the election. I think it ran like on Halloween or something like that. I can't remember the exact date, but it was again sort of referring to RCP or right-leaning and categorizing RCP as right-leaning when anybody that has been sort of a political junkie and has gone to RCP, they know that on that splash page, first of all, before you even get to the polling, there is a wide variety of different stories and angles and viewpoints that sort of bring the reader current. That's one of the reasons people go there. But the other more important reason is the way you aggregate polls, and you use a variety of different ones, and it almost always ends up being right on the spot. And the thing that I thought was so interesting in this last election cycle is that there was, as everyone probably knows that listens to this program, there was the Ancel poll that came out of Iowa that showed Trump behind Harris in by 3 percentage points. And
Right. And this, just so people know, this Ancel is a well-regarded pollster, works for the Des Moines Register. And when she came out with that poll just a couple days before the election, in a state where every other poll showed Trump winning by 10 points or so, it created quite a media firestorm, right?
It created a media firestorm, but it also sort of led the news, right? Wall Street Journal, New York Times, Washington Post, Politico, Axios, everybody had a story. And everybody was like, well, what if we're misreading Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan? Those are the same kind of working class and or rural voters who can change things. And it really pushed it pushed a narrative. What I thought at the time, I had seen your poll come out. You'd done Real Clear Defense did one with Emerson. Just maybe it wasn't even less than an hour before that showed what ended up being incredibly accurate with Trump up over 10 percentage points over Harris. But that, I mean, there was hardly anybody that wrote about that.
Yeah.
Or factored that in.
Yeah. Well, that was sort of, I guess that was sort of like a, dog bites man story. That was what everyone sort of expected.
Right.
The Ancel poll is interesting for a number of reasons. But one thing it made me think is, polling is, as we know, it's as much as art as it is a science. And that's why pollsters end up with slightly different answers to the question. And when they do, that's why we average them to try to get to reduce the margin of error, as it's called. So I wonder if the problem is polling or whether it's the way reporters report on polling, because there is sort of this patina of science about polling, and people sort of ascribe, I think, powers to it that really don't exist.
Yes, and I think there is in larger media or news organizations who aren't culturally connected to the people outside of New York and DC, a hesitancy to look at a poll that in their brain that universe is too right leaning.
Mm.
And it's not because they're bad reporters. It's because they don't know that this is the way things are outside of the major cities. And people in New York and Washington, D.C. do not decide elections.
Right.
People in the middle of Pennsylvania and Michigan and Wisconsin and North Carolina and Arizona do.
Yeah.
And you know, and they're two. I often look at the breakdown of polling, and my biggest beef is they're too educated. Well, what
Mm.
do I mean by that? Well, they have too much of an emphasis or weight with people with higher education when only, like in Pennsylvania, I think it's 37% of the people in Pennsylvania have a college degree.
Right. Yeah.
You got to be able to reflect that in your polling, or you're going to get Pennsylvania wrong.
Yeah.
That's why people don't understand Pennsylvania.
Well, you mentioned this New York Times article. It was pretty interesting too, because they criticized Real Clear Politics for not filtering out what they called, quote, low quality pollsters, and not weighing pollsters based on some past accuracy or some other thing. Our only goal, and I think this is true for the industry for the most part, is accuracy. We're just trying to be as accurate as possible. That's the lifeblood of what Real Clear Politics polling averages is. So we have no incentive to skew it one way or the other, because at the end of the day, people are going to look at it and say, if we were wrong, people will stop coming to the site. So the incentives are pretty lined up that way. But the idea that by not putting our finger on the scale to weigh one poll over another is somehow makes it right leaning, it just seemed to me sort of, just not accurate.
No, it's not. And I'm a reporter. If anybody's not familiar with my work is I live in Western Pennsylvania, and I spend most of my time in places like Pennsylvania and Ohio and Michigan and Wisconsin. And so I see a world that's very different from the perspective. I'm not saying one is better than the other. It's just different. And people in those parts of the country, I'm not saying they're Republican. However, I do believe culturally and politically, they're more center to center right.
Mm-hmm.
And because of how hard this last administration went, we always correct. The American voter always is like, oh, we went too far this way. Let's correct it back. And you could see the grains of that beginning almost immediately when Joe Biden made the decision in Afghanistan.
Yeah.
Well, people will argue, well, they didn't do well in the midterms. That was very, very sort of a number of layers of different things. Not great candidates, Roe v. Wade, people sort of didn't know how to react to it. It was a number of different things. I don't think it had anything to do with Biden being popular.